Welcome to the book of Chronicles, a record of kings, choices, and divine responses. In chapter 1, we meet King Solomon at the beginning of his reign. With humility, he seeks not wealth or victory, but wisdom. God honors his heart, granting him both discernment and abundance. This chapter teaches us what it truly means to lead with a heart aligned to God's will. Let's step into the story of a king who first chose understanding. Israel's sons too. These were the sons of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun to Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Judah to Hezron's sons 3. The sons of Judah, Onan, and Shelah. These 3 were born to him by a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua. Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. 4. Judah's daughter-in-law Tamar bore Perez and Zerah to Judah. He had 5 sons in all. 5. The sons of Perez, Hezron and Hamul. 6. The sons of Zerah, Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Dada. 5 in all. 7. The son of Carmi, Achara, who brought trouble on Israel by violating the ban on taking devoted things. 8. The son of Ethan, Azariah. 9. The sons born to Hezron were Jerahmeel, Ram, and Caleb. From Ram, son of Hezron. 10. Ram was the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, the leader of the people of Judah. 11. Nahshon was the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz. 12. Boaz the father of Obed, and Obed the father of Jesse. 13. Jesse was the father of Eliab, his firstborn. The second son was Abinadab, the third Shimeah. 14. The fourth Nethanel, the fifth Radai. 15. The sixth Uzim, and the seventh David. 16. Their sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail. Zeruiah's 3 sons were Abishai, Joab, and Asael. 17. Abigail was the mother of Amasa, whose father was Jether the Ishmaelite. Caleb son of Hezron. 18. Caleb son of Hezron had children by his wife Azubah, and by Jerioth. These were her sons, Jesher, Shobab, and Ardon. 19. When Azubah died, Caleb married Ephrath, who bore him Hur. 20. Hur was the father of Uri, and Uri the father of Bezalel. 21. Later, Hezron, when he was 60 years old, married the daughter of Machir, the father of Gilead. He made love to her, and she bore him Segub. 22. Segub was the father of Jair, who controlled 23 towns in Gilead. 23. But Geshur and Aram captured Havoth Jair, as well as Kenneth with its surrounding settlements, 60 towns. All these were descendants of Machir, the father of Gilead. 24. After Hezron died in Caleb Ephratah, Abijah the wife of Hezron bore him Ashur the father of Tekoa, Jerahmeel son of Hezron. 25. The sons of Jerahmeel, the firstborn of Hezron: Ram, his firstborn Bunah, Oren, Ozem, and Ahijah. 26. Jerahmeel had another wife whose name was Atara. She was the mother of Onam. 27. The sons of Nadab, Seled, and Appaim. Seled died without children. 31. The son of Appaim, Ishai, who was the father of Sheshan. Sheshan was the father of Alai. 32. The sons of Jada, Shammai's brother, Jether and Jonathan. Jether died without children. The sons of Jonathan, Peleth and Zaza. These were the descendants of Jerahmeel. 34. Sheshan had no sons, only daughters. He had an Egyptian servant named Jahar. 35. Sheshan gave his daughter in marriage to his servant Jahar, and she bore him Attai. 36. Attai was the father of Nathan. Nathan the father of Zabod. 37. Zebod the father of Ephlal. Ephlal the father of Obed. 38. Obed the father of Jehu. Jehu the father of Azariah. 39. Azariah the father of Helez. Helez the father of Eleazar. 40. Eleazar the father of Sismai, Sismai, the father of Shelum. 41. Shallum, the father of Jechamiah, and Jechamiah, the father of Elishama. The clans of Caleb. 42. The sons of Caleb, the brother of Jerahmeel. Mesha his firstborn, who was the father of Ziph, and his son Maresha, who was the father of Hebron. 43. The sons of Hebron. Korah, Tappuah, Rechem, and Shema. 44. Shema was the father of Raham, and Raham the father of Jorkiam. Rechem was the father of Shammai. 45. The son of Shammai was Maon, and Maon was the father of Beth-zur. 46. Caleb's concubine Ephah was the mother of Haran, Mosa, and Gazez. Haran was the father of Gozez. 47. The sons of Jaddai, Regem, Jotham, Jeshan, Pelet, Ephah, and Shaph. 48. Caleb's concubine Maachah was the mother of Sheba and Tirhanah. 49. She also gave birth to Shaph, the father of Madmannah, and to Shiva, the father of Machbenah and Gibeah. Caleb's daughter was Aksah. 50. These were the descendants of Caleb. The sons of Hur, the firstborn of Ephrathah, Shobal, the father of Kiriath Jearim. 51. Salma, the father of Bethlehem, and Hereph, the father of Beth-gader. 52. The descendants of Shobal, the father of Kiriath Jearim, were Harah, half the Manahathites. 53. And the clans of Kiriath Jearim, the Ithrites, Puthites, Shumathites, and Mishrites. From these descended the Zorathites and Eshtalites. Tepel. 54. The descendants of Salma, Bethlehem, the Netophathites, Atroth Beth Joab, Haraph the Manahathites, the Zorites. 55. In just one chapter, Solomon sets a standard for godly leadership, a heart that asks for wisdom over power. And God responds generously. As we continue this journey through 2 Chronicles, we'll see how Solomon's request shaped a kingdom and left a legacy. Subscribe, like, and comment to follow the rise of Israel's golden era and its eternal lessons for us today.